Welcome to Tales Told When the Windows Rattle. I'm Tim Prossel. I've done a considerable amount of research into the history of ghost hunting, and even long before the days of electronic energy sensing equipment, ghost hunts happened at night. A ghost hunter might stay up in a room supposedly haunted and just spend the night awake, hoping something would develop. But with very few exceptions, it always happens at night, and we have a strong association between ghosts and nighttime. This time on Tales Told, I want to share with you 3 stories of ghosts that came out during the day, ghosts that broke the rules. The first 2 come from an article titled Immaterialities, or Can Such Things Be? It appeared in Ainsworth magazine in 1846, and it's written by Charles Hooton. Now, Hooton refers to what's actually a very important document in the history of ghostology. It is Francis Grose's A Provincial Glossary with a collection of local proverbs and popular superstitions. It was published in 1787. Grose takes kind of a playful attitude toward ghosts. He doesn't seem to be a believer, but that was very typical for the late 1700s. There were certainly people who believed in ghosts, but the dominant thinking was ghosts are not real, and humanity has to grow up and progress beyond these superstitious beliefs. It's the middle of the 1800s when the pendulum swings back and people start saying, well, if there are no ghosts, then why are there so many reports of ghosts? Why is this such a persistent part of human history? We really need to investigate this. And that leads to organizations such as the Society for Psychical Research. Hooton was on the cutting edge of this shift in attitudes, and he takes his ghosts very seriously. Here's what he has to say about ghosts that appear during daylight hours. In Grose's Provincial Glossary, the idea that spectral appearances are almost peculiar to twilight or deep darkness is held up as a matter of ridicule and indirect testimony to their being only the creations of an excited imagination. But the 2 following anecdotes, it will be seen, relate to circumstances both of hearing and seeing very unusual things in the broad open day. The first came within my own observation and may safely be relied upon. The second was communicated by a friend who had every means of verifying the story and who equally knows it to be true. In a large Midland manufacturing town where lace is the staple article of production, it is well known to be a common thing to employ great numbers of young women and girls in the mending of that article. They are assembled together in large rooms under the superintendence of certain men such as bookkeepers, clerks, etc. A disused cotton mill, situated in a principal thoroughfare of the town alluded to, had been converted into a warehouse of this kind. There it was the present incident occurred. It was customary for all the workpeople to go to dinner at the hour of 1 and return again at 2, the last one who went out locking the door and carrying away the key. On one occasion, during the summertime, it chanced that the bookkeeper was momentarily out of the way when the young women went to dinner, so that under the presumption that he had already gone away, the door was locked upon him, and he was left alone to ruminate or do as he pleased without his meal until the return of the people at the regular hour. Under these circumstances, and thinking it was no great denial or very lengthened imprisonment after all, he perched himself again upon his stool and recommenced making up his books. To his surprise, however, he very shortly heard someone walking across the floor of the room over his head. He congratulated himself upon not being wholly solitary, as he took it for granted that one of the girls who worked above had got locked in as well as himself. Every minute he expected to see her come down a broad stepladder, which formed the communication between the 2 rooms. But he was disappointed. He accordingly ascended the steps sufficiently high to bring his head above the upper floor for the purpose of ascertaining who it was that shared his temporary confinement. Nobody could be seen. He called, "Who's there?" repeatedly, but received no answer. He returned to his books, convinced that he had been mistaken, but the footsteps about the floor over his head were repeated instantly, and too distinctly to be at all misunderstood or mistaken for some other sound. He looked up again and again called,
"Who's there?"
but with the same result. After that, the sound evidently approached the top of the ladder, exactly as though the individual was about to descend, and momentarily did he expect to see the appearance of the lower extremities. But nothing came. It then walked back again, and up and down, and eventually trod upon the higher steps of the ladder. It descended considerably, but nothing whatever was visible. Although it was the middle of a bright day, although the dwellings on the opposite side of a narrow street were so close to him, and with the windows of the room open he could see the people passing along within speaking distance below him, he began to feel embarrassed and alarmed. There could be no disputing about the reality of the footsteps, nor that they were caused by something to his sight invisible. They still continued, and he screwed up courage enough to go and look a third time, when the object appeared to be close to the top of the ladder and, if alive, unable to hide itself before he should get there. His firm impression that time was that he should certainly behold some dreadful apparition. Nothing of the kind occurred. The room was empty. He returned to the window and tried to keep himself quiet and assured until 2 o'clock by looking out, but never, he confessed afterwards, did any day of his life seem so endless as those horrible 60 minutes. The disturbance was repeated at intervals until at length the welcome sound of the key thrust into the door on the outside saluted his ears, and the welcome sight of the returned workpeople met his eyes. It was no matter for them to discover that something had occurred. The bookkeeper looked exceedingly ill and terrified. With some trouble he was induced to relate what had happened. The first thing was to ascertain whether anyone really had been left in besides himself. The people were counted as they entered, and it was found that he had really been alone. Next, a search above stairs was proposed and immediately undertaken. Now, the room in which the noises had been heard was in the roof. The sides were partially closed up with a slight partition containing various doors, so as to cut off the angle formed by the meeting of the roof with the floor. Thus did they constitute a sort of series of closets, although they had never been used for any purpose since the building was adapted as a cotton mill. All these closets were examined one by one, but nothing whatever was found in any of them, save part of a small shirt covered with blood. An old story was then brought to mind concerning a poor boy who had been missing from that same mill, whom some people said had met a foul death there. Others interested in the matter declared he had merely run away, but, to a certainty, no tidings had ever been heard from the day of his mysterious disappearance to the present. The above circumstances were taken as conclusive evidence of the truth of the more dark and criminal interpretation, but no culprit, if any existed, could be traced, nor was the visionary walker on the top story ever heard afterwards. A second anecdote of a daylight appearance is as follows, the circumstances related having occurred considerably within 2 years of the present time of writing. A respectable married woman, will identify her as H., residing in a somewhat retired place within a short distance of a country town well known to the writer, was one day employed about her ordinary household duties. About noon, having occasion to go into the garden behind the house, which was separated from an adjoining croft by a rather low fence, she saw a man standing on the opposite side of the latter, looking over into the garden. Although the whole was private property, and therefore the individual must be on trespass, she took no further notice of the matter than consisted in remarking to herself that the fellow looked very poorly, and might have got into the croft as preferring the grass to the dusty highway. About 3/4 of an hour afterwards, she had occasion to go into the garden the second time. To her surprise, she found the same man standing there still, in the same attitude and place as before. The singularity of the circumstance caused her to look at him more intently. To her horror, She instantly recognized him to be her brother, who had been dead several years. He looked wan and ill, and his glassy eyes were fixed deadly and immovably upon her. She gazed upon him during the space, she thought, of several minutes, but could not speak. At length she summoned resolution to approach nearer, but in so doing momentarily reverted her eyes from the object, and as instantaneously it had vanished. The croft was empty. Not a blade of grass appeared to have bent beneath anyone's foot, nor was any sign of a living creature to be seen either far or near. On reaching her house, she instantly fainted from terror and continued ill during a considerable period afterwards. The possibility of mistake or misconception is not, in this case, even remotely admitted by the individual who beheld this curious appearance, and the complete and instantaneous disappearance of the figure entirely precludes the probability that it was a living person. This next story of a daylight ghost comes from an article titled "More Ghosts, Old and New." We don't know who the author is. It was published in an 1868 issue of Dublin University magazine, and that's kind of interesting because it's set in Wales, which, like Ireland, is a Celtic country, and it introduces a fetch. I did a little bit of research, and as I understand it, a fetch is not a ghost. It's something more like a doppelganger. If you happen to see yourself, or someone sees you but it isn't you, it's your fetch, that's probably bad news. It could be a sign that you're going to die. Now, I did see one article that said a fetch might be a sign of something positive. Nonetheless, in this story, it doesn't seem to be a fetch at all. It seems to be a pretty traditional ghost. So I'm not sure why the term fetch is used. Maybe it was just a general term for anything supernatural, uncanny, that kind of thing. Let me read you the piece. Here's a story lately told to me by a friend, a senior of his own standing, which presented itself to him a long time ago in Wales when he was fishing in the River Usk. The teller of the tale is essentially a practical rather than an imaginative or romantic individual with nothing dreamy or superstitious in his mental or cerebral development. Strolling down the bank on a fine summer's day, rod in hand, on the lookout for a favorable spot in which to try a cast, he stopped at a place which appeared inviting. The Usk abounds in rocky islets. Opposite to him and near the center of the stream was one of these, rather elevated. On the other side, between the rock and the mainland, the current ran with much rapidity and somewhat turbidly, as if disturbed and intercepted by obstacles below the surface. The depth of the water was much greater than that on the side our fishermen had selected. This he knew from former visits and observations. Suddenly he looked up and saw a little girl of 6 or 7 years old in a bonnet and cloak with a basket on her arm, standing quite alone on the summit of the island. She remained for some time, and he continued to look steadily on the unexpected object, wondering how she got there, as without a boat, access to the place where she stood was utterly impossible. He had his fishing boots on and tried to wade across to her, but the river was too deep. Determined to satisfy himself, he moved further down until he reached a fordable point and crossed over to the other side. There, to his increased surprise, he saw the child standing, having left the island. No vestige of a boat or raft or any contrivance by which her passage could have been effected presented itself. This, of course, added to his astonishment, and he walked towards her. When within a short distance, she moved across a field or two in the direction of a cottage on an eminence backed by a wood. She ascended some steps on the side of the hill, opened the door, and disappeared within. There could be no mistake. He was certain of the fact and identity of the person, for he had noted her dress and appearance with minute attention. He followed quickly, reached the cottage, knocked at the door, and was told to come in. There he saw a man and woman, apparently his wife, sitting by the kitchen fire. The attitude of the man was desponding, his head on his hand while his elbow rested on the knee. The visitor asked where the little girl was who had just preceded him into the cottage. The reply from the man was, "No little girl has entered here. We had but one, and we lost her some months ago. She is dead." He then pointed to a cloak, bonnet, and basket on the wall, and said, "Those were hers, and there she always left them." The stranger instantly recognized them as those he had seen. "Then," replied the man solemnly, "you have seen her fetch. She was our only child, most dear to us, and allowed by all to be the best girl in the school she attended." After a little more conversation, he pressed a gratuity on them which they were unwilling to take, and not liking his own reflections, he left the cottage. He then went to the school in the immediate neighborhood to obtain further particulars. Everything he had been told was corroborated by the schoolmistress, who also took him to the child's grave in the village churchyard. Here the incident ended. Nothing more ensued, nor had the person to whom the vision appeared the slightest connection with or interest in the parties concerned. He cannot persuade himself that it was a bona fide ghost, and to this hour remains undecided as to what it really was. I'm left wondering what made this fisherman so resistant to the idea that he had encountered an actual ghost. Is it because it happened during daylight hours? Maybe so. If you're interested in these ghost stories and the many, many questions that they raise, these allegedly true ghost stories published in Victorian books and magazines, then please visit my website at ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. It's still a fairly new website, but I'm continually putting stuff up there. I'm just doing it kind of gradually. And if you have any comments, do feel free to put those comments there. Once again, you'll find it at ghostlyhearthside.wordpress.com. I'm Tim Prossel, asking the ageless question, who's there? Who's there?